Let's set our fantasy football lineups together. Welcome back to week 3 matchups that matter, where we go through all of the relevant start-sit information that you guys might need to make informed decisions, from over-unders to implied point totals, wide receiver cornerback matchups, which quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends have good matchups, which quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends have bad matchups, as well as some streamers for those of you sickos that still play with defenses and kickers. So if you guys are new around here, hit the subscribe button down below. While you're down there, leave a like if you enjoyed. Now let's get into it. All right, let's get this thing kicked off with the top over-unders. And as always, if you guys want access to this information, that will be linked down below in the pinned comment of how you can get that. We're going to go through the top 5 over-unders this week. We have a heater on deck with a 54-point over-under between the Chargers and the Vikings. That game should be very, very fantasy-friendly. So as I'm going through all this stuff, if you guys have a start-sit decision, definitely, take some notes. Think about what is in favor of each guy. For example, in my home league, I have Elijah Moore versus Josh Kelly. So a high over-under in that Chargers-Vikings game, definitely 1 point to Josh Kelly. The Dolphins and Broncos, 48.5-point over-under, 47.5-point over-under in the Bears-Chiefs game. Lions and Falcons with a 46.5-point over-under. And then Eagles and Buccaneers on Monday Night Football with a 46-point over-under. So relatively high-scoring slate this week. Definitely good news for us fantasy football fans. And then a bottom 5 over-unders. These are games that you maybe want to avoid, or maybe want to use some of this information as a tiebreaker if you guys are caught between a start-sit decision. The Patriots and Jets game, 36.5-point over-under. I believe that's the lowest of the season so far. 39.5 for the Browns and Titans. Seahawks and Panthers, 42 points. 42.5 for the Packers and Saints. And then Cowboys, Cardinals, Vegas, and Steelers also at 43 points. So not the best game environments. Ideally, we don't want to, favor this information completely, but you do want to use it as a tiebreaker, like I mentioned. As far as implied point totals, a lot of teams implied for over 27, over 25 points. I believe we have 8 or 9 teams implied for over 25. Kansas City Chiefs up there at 30, Cowboys at 27.75, Vikings at 27.5. Dolphins and 49ers also in a good spot. And then as far as the lowest implied point totals, the usual suspects: Arizona Cardinals, New York Giants, New York Jets, Chicago Bears, and Houston Texans. So keep that in mind when you're making your lineup decisions. And as far as where the sharps are betting, because, Vegas isn't going to get everything right, we want to definitely look at the trends on these line movements. And of course, make sure to check this information if you guys do have access to these tables every Sunday morning, because things change sometimes. The sharps are betting one way and then the lines move and they start betting the other way and that kind of thing. So Baltimore Ravens, Indianapolis Colts, they're taking the over in that game slightly, but the Dolphins Broncos is the one getting the most steam, as well as that Vikings Chargers game. So those two games already very high over-unders, and the sharps are hammering the over at this point in time. So definitely, if you guys have players from that game, that is definitely a point in their favor. If you're deciding between, Javonte Williams and James Conner or something like that, maybe you go Javonte Williams given the high-scoring nature of that game. And for me, like I said, I'm deciding between Josh Kelly and Elijah Moore, and that Browns game is probably going to be a lower over-under, with the sharps taking a lot of the money on the under right now. You guys can see it there, 39.5 points. Under is getting 99% of the money. So far, I'm leaning towards Josh Kelly, assuming Austin Eckler is out. And then again, you guys can see the rest of these games that are expected to go under. One of the higher over-under games, the Chiefs and Bears, is actually catching some steam on the under, so keep that in mind as well. Now let's get into the advanced data points. So these are things like pace of play, which is definitely a relevant statistic, something that we want to keep in mind, because the Packers and the Falcons game last week was a good example of this. We weren't expecting a super, super high-scoring game, and the Commanders-Broncos was also like this as well. But when both teams are running up-tempo offenses, you actually get to see a lot more points and a lot more plays run, which in turn leads to more fantasy production. So the Cowboys-Cardinals, even though the Cowboys are implied for so many points, the Cardinals should be running a lot of plays. The Raiders and Steelers as well, the Eagles and Buccaneers, and then the Jags-Texans game, and then the 49ers-Giants game tonight, also expected to be pretty fast-paced. And then when we look at the slower-paced games, Packers and Saints, probably a game you want to avoid. We see that Browns-Titans game crop up again, probably not one that you want to be targeting. Seahawks and Panthers as well. You guys get the idea. So target the fast-paced games, target the high-scoring games when you guys are making these decisions. In terms of offensive DVOA, so basically the strength of an average offense over expected is what offensive DVOA means of the far left column, so the team that we're looking at, versus the opponent, so their week 3 opponent's defensive DVOA. We can come up with kind of like a matchup advantage or a matchup disadvantage. So for example, the highest advantage on the week is the Atlanta Falcons offense, which has been pretty good so far this year, versus the Detroit Lions defense, which has been pretty bad so far this year. So that is a pretty good setup offensively for the Falcons. So definitely keep that in mind if you're deciding between, Drake London and somebody else. So Drake London's in a pretty good spot. Bengals versus Rams, obviously also a pretty good spot there for the Cincinnati offense to get right. Vikings, Jags, and Bears also in pretty decent spots. As far as who's not in a good spot, Titans already a bad offense, Commanders already a bad offense, etc. Going up against some tough defenses definitely adds fuel to the fire to maybe want to sit some of those players. So now let's get into the shadow coverage matchup. So if you guys are deciding between 2 wide receivers, maybe this is something that you use as a tiebreaker. But again, we want to take a holistic view, take out a pad and paper and, jot down your lineup decision and give each guy a point in each category and that kind of thing to make sure you guys are taking a holistic view of all the information we have. The red matchups, so the guys that are expected to be shadow covered or at least expected to see very, very difficult outside corners in these games. We have the Patriots wide receivers. Maybe you want to leave those guys on your bench. DeAndre Hopkins and Treylon Burks going up against a pretty fierce Browns secondary. Not a good matchup for those guys. Maybe you want to leave them on your bench, although you're probably going to have to start Hopkins if you drafted him highly. DJ Moore and Hollywood Brown, also guys maybe you want to leave on your bench. DJ Moore is expected to see shadow coverage from L'Jarius Sneed, so not a great situation for him. As far as the yellow matchups, so these ones, the corners they're going up against are good, but, the receivers are probably good enough to beat these matchups in a neutral situation. So Tyreek Hill versus Patrick Surtain. We know Pat Surtain is really good, but he has allowed some stuff so far this season. He allowed a touchdown to Terry McLaurin last week, so on and so forth. Terry McLaurin facing Tre'Davious White. Not a great matchup, but Terry's good enough to beat him. Evans versus Slay. Godwin versus Bradbury. Those Eagles corners can be tough, but they have had a little bit of a weaker start to the season. A.J. Brown versus Carlton Davis. Carlton was out last week. He probably would have shadowed DJ Moore if he played, but he did shadow Justin Jefferson in the first game. Jefferson had no problems beating him. I don't expect A.J. Brown to either. And then Garrett Wilson versus Christian Gonzalez. Christian Gonzalez showed a little bit of shadow coverage last week. Maybe they keep that up with a opposing number 1 receiver like Tyreek Hill. So those are the middling matchups. And then as far as the ones that are a little bit easier, the guys that we expect to probably dominate these matchups, Vikings wide receivers, Ravens wide receivers, 49ers wide receivers, and Chargers wide receivers, all in very good spots to smash this week. And I also tweeted this out earlier today, just given the cornerback and wide receiver statistics I have access to, I thought it would be interesting to look at yards per route covered allowed, which is basically the cornerback version of yards per route run, aka these guys stink. They're allowing big plays, they're allowing a lot of catches and that kind of thing. It looks like Christian Fulton, who's going to be facing primarily Amari Cooper, but also some Elijah Moore as well. That's a good setup for Amari Cooper, although that game's expected to be a lower over-under. Darrell Baker for the Colts, expected to see a whole lot of Odell Beckham Jr., so maybe he's a guy that you want to flex, but he also will see some Zay Flowers as well. And then the Chargers corner, J.C. Jackson, who hypothetically is a good corner, has not been good since moving over to Los Angeles. That could be a very good spot for Justin Jefferson, who he will be primarily matched up with, but he should also see some Jordan Addison as well. So the top 3 cornerbacks in yards per route covered right now, Martin Emerson, who's going to be facing primarily DeAndre Hopkins, Zion McCollum for the Buccaneers facing primarily A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, and then Jeremy Chin, probably most likely going to see a lot of Jackson Smith and Jigba, but maybe a little bit of Tyler Lockett if he works out of the slot as well. So maybe potentially downgrade some expectations for those guys. A.J. Brown and Smith you're not really worried about, but JSN, maybe you leave him on your bench this week, as well as Treylon Burks. Now let's get into kind of position by position, who has good matchups, who has bad matchups. Let's start it off with the quarterback position. You guys can see the top 5 quarterback matchups on the screen. I made some adjustments to the actual way that I calculated this because we don't have adjusted fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position data yet. We won't have that until week 3, according to my data source there. So we're just going off of base fantasy points allowed, and we also have rank and pass defense DVOA for quarterbacks, and then I'll kind of get into the changes for running backs and wide receivers. This should give us a more accurate depiction of what we're looking at. And this data now is all based on this year. So keep in mind, it is a small sample size. Patrick Mahomes has a great matchup. Obviously, you were going to start him anyway, but he will crush this week, probably against the Bears defense. RIP if you guys have to face Patrick Mahomes. Kirk Cousins, great matchup this week. He definitely needs to be in your lineup as a top 6 quarterback, 54-point over-under. Easy matchup against the Chargers defense. He should be money this week. Matthew Stafford is a great streaming option against the Bengals, who have been a pretty soft defense without Jesse Bates this year. I wouldn't mess with Desmond Ridder or Baker Mayfield despite the good matchups, but I suppose if you're desperate, you could do worse. And then the bottom 5 quarterback matchups. So these are the guys that you maybe want to leave on your bench or maybe find alternative options. Ryan Tannehill, Jordan Love, Sam Howell, and Geno Smith not in great positions this week. Doubt anybody would ever consider starting Josh Dobbs, but I would say definitely don't start him either. If you have these guys that I just mentioned, maybe see if Anthony Richardson, Brock Purdy, Jared Goff, or Russell Wilson are available in that order is the way that I would start those guys if you have the option there. And then let's move on to the running back position, where you guys can see we have a big time smash spot upcoming for Kenneth Walker against the Panthers run defense. They've been very good against the pass, not very good against the run. Seahawks are 6-point favorites. Bryce Young isn't practicing. Should be a good spot for Kenneth Walker, maybe a guy that you could maybe buy low on, although he did have a big game last week. Should see an interesting uptick for the ACL bros. Both of them have good matchups after coming off of bad matchups last week. So with Breece and Javonte, we had like the Cowboys and Commanders last week, both really tough run defenses. This week, they get the Patriots and the Dolphins respectively. So I would definitely try and buy low on Breece Hall and Javonte Williams while you still can, because it's possible that they get back upticks in their workload, efficiency increases, that kind of thing. So definitely buy low if you guys can still do that on those players. Isaiah Pacheco is in your lineup. It's a great game script. He's going up against the Bears, who are terrible against the run. And the Chiefs are 12.5-point home favorites this week. Kendre Miller is also a top priority add for me this week on waivers. So if you guys still haven't had your waivers yet, or Kendre Miller is still out there, definitely put in a claim for him. With Jamal Williams expected to be out for multiple weeks, Alvin Kamara still suspended. He was a full participant in Wednesday practice, which is a good sign towards his availability this week. And Tony Jones is absolute dust, so I don't really worry about him eating into Kendre Miller's workload. I actually have him as a top 32 running back this week, and I think he's a fine flex play if you need one. As far as the bottom 5 running back matchups, you guys can see a lot of fringe guys with bad matchups. James Conner, Zach Moss, Gus Edwards, Dameon Pierce. These guys are all kind of fringe starters, maybe minus James Conner given his workload. But I do have guys like Breece Hall, Javonte Williams, Alexander Mattison, Brian Robinson, Rashad White. Somebody like that I would prefer to start over all of the names that I just mentioned. But all of their workloads are solid. I mean, Conner gets pretty much everything. Moss got pretty much everything last week with Justice Hill out. Gus Edwards is going to have a decent workload. Dameon Pierce is still split in the backfield, but the Texans have been decent on offense. So definitely downgrade those guys. Maybe sit them if you have better options, but they are still potentially starters if you are screwed at that position. Also a downgrade for DeAndre Swift. We'll also have to see how Kenneth Gainwell coming back affects his workload, because Kenneth Gainwell, they played on Thursday night and they don't play till Monday night. So he has 11 days to recover between games. We'll see how that split kind of shakes out for DeAndre Swift and Kenneth Gainwell going forward. It's possible that Swift kind of Wally pipped him and he's just going to take the workload. But I do think that Kenneth Gainwell, if he's healthy, might eat into that Swift workload, and maybe you want to sell high on DeAndre Swift before that happens. Wide receiver matchups this week, the top 5 you guys can see on the screen there. Justin Jefferson and Devontae Adams are both in smash spots. RIP, especially if you play against Justin Jefferson this week, he could absolutely erupt. Jamar Chase could also explode, and he was my number 1 buy low at the wide receiver position. The Rams have a sneaky bad defense, especially against fantasy wide receivers, especially against the pass. They just had Deebo Samuel have a big week last week. They allowed a touchdown to DK Metcalf in week 1, so definitely keep an eye on Jamar Chase in this Bengals offense bouncing back this week. I think this is the week that they do it, assuming that Joe Burrow is on the field. And then as far as the rest of these matchups, T. Higgins is in your lineup, Amari Cooper is in your lineup, Jordan Addison's in your lineup, Zay Flowers is in your lineup, and I think Elijah Moore, Jacoby Myers, and Odell Beckham Jr., who are also top 5 matchups in this chart here, are also decent flex options if you need them. And then as far as the bottom 5 wide receiver matchups here, we have Marquise Brown and every Packers wide receiver not named Christian Watson if he plays. Probably leaving those guys on your bench, as well as Jackson Smith and Jigba and Zay Jones if you can help it. And I would say temper expectations for DeAndre Hopkins, for Christian Watson if he plays, for Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk, and as well as the Seahawks top duo of DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Those guys not in very good spots to potentially smash this week, but they're probably still in your lineup. As far as the tight end matchups are concerned, not a whole lot going on here. We have Tyler Higbee and Pat Freiermuth, who make for good streamers this week. If you guys need somebody, I think both of them should be, even potentially available on waivers in your league, if not on your bench, and they've kind of been disappointing so far. Probably not messing with any of these other tertiary guys, though. Cade Otton, Adam Troutman, and Durham Smythe all have good matchups, but I don't really care about those guys. And then as far as the bottom 5 tight end matchups, we have Chigakonkwo, Gerald Everett, and the Buffalo Bills tight ends. Probably better to be left on your bench, especially with Knox and Kincaid kind of splitting snaps, even though they're expected to score a lot of points in that game. Both of those guys are kind of blending together and cannibalizing each other at this point in time, so I probably wouldn't mess with any of those guys. And finally, we get into the absolute sickos. Again, I talked about you guys' leagues being prehistoric if you still play with kickers and defenses, but I'm not here to judge. If you guys do need some defensive streamers this week, I think the Titans are a really good option. I talked about how low of an over-under that's expected to be. Deshaun Watson isn't really playing that well. It's definitely a good option there. The Kansas City Chiefs are 12.5-point home favorites against Justin Fields, who apparently is going to unleash the other part of his game, so that could be a good spot for a streaming defense. And then the Seattle Seahawks, also at home, versus Bryce Young, who struggled so far, who isn't even practicing right now, so we might even get Andy Dalton out of the Carolina Panthers. Definitely keep those 3 defenses at the top of your mind. I'm sure the 49ers, Cowboys, Patriots, and Jets are probably rostered already, but those defenses are also very good options this week. Sneaky options if none of the defenses that I just talked about are available in your league. The Raiders, Texans, and Jaguars are also pretty decent options as well. Kickers, just attack high over-under games. Get yourself some good kickers for good offenses. But hopefully you guys got some value from this. Again, if I were you guys listening to this video, I would 100%, write down all my start-sit decisions and kind of score points in favor of one guy over the other and be like, hey, I'm deciding between Josh Kelly and Elijah Moore this week. Josh Kelly had 6 points and Elijah Moore had 2 points. So maybe the process dictates that I go with Josh Kelly, assuming Austin Eckler is out this week. So definitely keep that in mind while you guys are watching these Matchups That Matters videos. Hopefully, if you guys enjoyed this video, you leave a like down below. Really work hard on this stuff, and we really appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new around here. That also helps our audience grow, and we really appreciate it. As well, if you guys want access to this data, if you want access to this information, like I said, it gets updated Sunday mornings before the games actually go live, and oftentimes there are changes. There's line movement, their sharps are changing where they're betting, and there's just more information at the end of the week as opposed to the middle of the week like we're at right now. So definitely pay attention to that if you guys have access to this data, and if you don't have access to it, you can get access to it by going down to the link down below, subscribing on flockfantasy.com, promo code FSE, or you can also go to Underdog Fantasy and deposit $10 using promo code FSE. Both will also get you access to our rest of season rankings if you guys are looking to make trades, and it'll get you access to our weekly rankings as well for your start-sit decisions. So with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.